Our next speaker is Dr. Sharon Koehn, Simon Fraser University. Sharon is a clinical research professor in the Department of Gerontology at Simon Fraser University and a research associate at Providence Healthcare. Trained as a medical anthropologist, she conducts interdisciplinary, community-based research with immigrant older adults on dementia, healthcare access, chronic disease self-management support, quality of life, and mental health promotion. Sharon, welcome.
All right, thank you, Doreen. I'm going to move this down, I'm short. And thank you so much to the previous speakers for setting up so nicely the talk that I'm going to give today. Mark's talk was especially helpful because it means I won't have to say a bunch of the stuff that I was going to. So that's great. All right. We got my slide up? Oh, there we go. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to say that this presentation today summarizes a published article that you can access. So if you are interested in this, I actually made the title the same name as the article, so you can go to the article and read that at your leisure. And I'll tell you how you can do that at the end, because you won't remember if I tell you now. Okay. All right, so increasingly Canada's immigrants are arriving from Asian rather than European countries of origin. And this trend is seen among those who immigrate later in life as well. The majority of immigrant seniors in the province of British Columbia, as in Canada, arrive from China and then India, particularly from Punjab. So what this crazy little visual shows you here is that almost a third of older adults in Canada are actually immigrants. And the majority of immigrant seniors in BC, as I said, are from China and India. So a lot of them then would be classified as visible minorities. So in Surrey, Abbotsford, and Mission, as everybody well knows, we have very high proportions of immigrants from South Asia, and many of those are Punjabis, or speak Punjabi in the home. So in Surrey, we have about a third of the population is South Asian, and in Abbotsford, about 1/5. And Punjabi is certainly the most common language spoken at home, other than English, in those two communities. Now, when I'm talking about late-in-life immigrants, I'm primarily talking about sponsored immigrants. And we know that amongst those late-in-life immigrants, the risk of mental illness is higher than those, higher among those who migrate after the age of 65. And we also know from the research that in Canada, older immigrant women from Chinese-speaking and South Asian countries are especially prone to depression. The mental well-being of immigrant older adults is affected, as Mark has already laid out, by the common experiences of resettlement stress, poverty, racism, intergenerational conflict, and family separation. And the disturbance of family support structure and decline in individual self-worth can negatively influence both mental health status and access to mental health services. This is especially true for older adults whose immigration is sponsored by their adult children, which, as I said, is true of 80% of persons who arrive in Canada after the age of 60. Amongst older adults, there are a small number of refugees. The older adults who come as refugees, about 4%. So it's a very small number. You saw that in the other statistics too, in terms of who VAST is serving. However, we know that many people who have experienced refugee situations do come as immigrants. They often are sponsored by their refugee children. So we do need to bear that in mind as well. So the sponsors of these older family class immigrants are financially responsible for them for 20 years post-migration. This has, in the last couple of years, gone up from 10 years to 20 years, which is abominable. I have testified before Senate Committee on Aging and given evidence to show that really what we needed to do was reduce that period to 5 years, as it has been reduced for sponsored spouses. The vulnerabilities amongst this population are at least as high. The government's response was to double it to 20 years. So, and the Senate Committee on Aging, did in fact endorse our recommendation that that period be reduced. So. There's an election coming. So the sponsors of these older family class immigrants are financially responsible for them for 20 years post-migration, and during this time, they may not be eligible for pensions, social services, extended medical and housing subsidies, and so on, depending on the province in which they live. One of the issues is that there's a lot of variability across the different provinces. So knowing all of this, a group of researchers and community partners who were engaged in health promotion decided to form the Punjabi Seniors Wellness Coalition. And we were funded in 2010 by a Community Action Initiative funding. That's from the provincial government. And we wanted to know what role, if any, do community service agencies play in supporting immigrant Punjabi older adults to sustain or recover their mental well-being following migration to Canada. Okay. So we specifically focused our research in the Fraser Valley, and we held forums, 2 forums, one in Surrey and one in Abbotsford. The Abbotsford Forum included participants from Mission as well, which is close by. So we had a large, a medium-sized, and a small town included. And the population in both Surrey and Abbotsford, about 20% of the population speak Punjabi in those municipalities. The service provider participants in the forum were selected to represent local services that work with Punjabi older adults and their families. So they weren't exclusively from the immigrant serving sector. There were many more of those represented in the Surrey forum because there aren't very many immigrant serving organizations in Abbotsford. That has been identified as a problem. And so we did see very different things between the groups, the services offered, and the groups available in those communities. I won't go into that here, but I can certainly speak to it later. We also invited to these forums Punjabi seniors, and we were able to get a total of 46 seniors across the 2 groups. So we had 26 in Abbotsford, 20 in Surrey. And altogether, that included 24 women and 22 men. And as I said, the Abbotsford group included people from Mission as well. So we went to a lot of, we did a lot of work with recruitment of these seniors, provided transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Before we held the forums, we wanted to find out what it was that people did in their agencies. So we sent out a survey to all 28 service provider participants. The survey was completed by 18 of them, but that's because some of those 28 came from the same agency. So only one person from the agency would fill it out. They may have done slightly different things, but they consulted with each other to include all the things that they did. So we do have a report that really goes into a fair bit of detail on this, as well as a publication. But you can look in the appendices of that report to see what they all said. And all of the material that I ever produce is up on a ResearchGate page. As I say, you can just Google ResearchGate, Sharon Koehn, and by doing so, you can access any of the publications and reports and so on that I've uploaded there. You don't have to be an academic. You don't have to be affiliated with a library, which is why I love it. It basically makes my stuff open access. So please feel free to go and check that out if you want to know who was involved and how they responded to these questions. And some of you online probably were part of that. So what we asked them was about their clients' demographics, the types of services they offered, and what determinants of mental health they address. And as you see here, I say relative to the Vic Health framework, that was quite important in terms of what we did. Now, I've got the determinants of the mental health framework up here, and I'd just like to emphasize why this is important. One of the things that we see is that governments are placing increased emphasis on mental health promotion across the lifespan in order to optimize return on investment. Bet you've heard that term before, right? ROI. The thing with ROI studies, though, in this area is that they are beleaguered by the difficulty of defining mental health promotion activities, for one thing, and on the other hand, they find that investment in one sector, such as immigrant settlement, will be reflected in another, like healthcare. So it really makes cause and effect relationships difficult to ascertain. And often we find that the people who are providing the services, in this case the immigrant serving organizations, are not getting the credit for the enormous amount of work that they do that shows up in positive health results. So really, that is the point of this presentation today, is to show what that relationship is. And that is clearly laid out in our paper as well. So you can refer to that and use it as evidence when you put in your proposals for funding in this area. So Keleher and Armstrong's Vic Health Framework is an evidence-based mental health promotion resource that was developed in response to the need to clarify the types of activities that contributed to mental health. Okay? A lot of this, for those of you in immigrant service organizations, is going to be a no-brainer. You know this stuff already. So you will recognize that we found, you will not find it surprising that we found that service providers working in these organizations, particularly those that were targeted at specifically at immigrants, versus the broader-based community services that accommodate immigrants, we're delivering services that addressed all three clusters identified in the framework. So you see the three clusters here are social inclusion, freedom from violence and discrimination, and access to economic resources and participation. And as you look at those categories up on the screen, I'm sure you recognize that this is all the work that you do. We decided to add, on the advice of our advisory committee, who were seniors and immigrant service providers from those communities, other activities supportive of mental well-being, because we know that also immigrant serving agencies provide counseling and other physical and mental health promotion programs that are more direct in nature as well. So when we asked them to fill out fill out the surveys, we saw that the kinds of activities that community service agencies engage in the most are those that promote social inclusion and increase access to economic resources and participation. However, one activity that is important to promoting freedom from violence and discrimination, promoting self-determination and control of one's life, was mentioned by 2/3 of the service provider participants who completed this survey. So let me just give you an example. That these activities are often consciously included in programs. We had an example of a program that was providing language services, language and community orientation services to immigrant older women, specifically Punjabi women. This was a program in Mission that's since been cut. That program was providing access to resources, specifically to education, right, with the language services. It was also promoting social inclusion because the women would get together with each other and provide an enormous amount of peer support to one another. And in improving the English of these women, the program was also promoting their broader social inclusion in the community, because then they could communicate with non-Punjabi speakers, English speakers. And finally, it was also promoting self-determination and control of one's life by teaching women, for example, how to take the bus to a shopping center where they were taken to an ice cream stand and asked to choose their own flavor of ice cream. Now, this may seem pretty minimal to you, but many of these women had never chosen their flavor of ice cream before. That was left up to their families to decide. And this provided them with something that we in academics call, or in health promotion call, self-efficacy, which is to say that they had the confidence in their own decisions, right, and the ability to do those things. And many service providers were, as I say, quite conscious of those components and included them in their work. These are precisely the things that are being found to promote mental well-being. So just to look at the activities that had decreasing numbers of service providers, say that these are what we include. We see that representatives of all classes of social determinants are included here, as well as the direct approach to treating challenges to mental wellness through therapeutic counseling, for example. So I think the important thing here is that recognizing these strengths is important for both the providers themselves and for their funders. The framework also provides clues as to how specific agencies might bolster their support of mental well-being of their senior immigrant clients, and it may also provide suggestions for benchmarks as to where they might want to go in funding proposals. Let's just tell you a little about the forum activities. So we didn't refer to what we were doing as mental health because that's quite stigmatized, as you've already covered. We referred to this as wellness. That's why we were the Punjabi Seniors Wellness Coalition. But we did have a guest speaker in who spoke about mental health and pointed out that it's perfectly normal for many people to experience times when mental health isn't optimal, particularly when they do something really big in their lives, like migrate to another country, particularly as seniors. And what we heard was a great deal of very positive feedback about the normalization of those struggles. So that was a very positive thing to do, and the seniors would like more information like that, so it can be packaged in such a way that people are willing to hear about mental illness and mental health, but it needs to wear different clothes to begin with. So we outlined the day's events to everybody, both in Punjabi and English. I have to say that what was really important in accomplishing this goal was my partnership with people out at University of the Fraser Valley, particularly Satwinder Baines, who has worked in the immigrant serving sector for many years before she became an academic. And also partnered with Jazz Chima in Fraser Health. They were incredibly helpful, and so was our community advisory committee as well. So this is how we managed to use their know-how to really get a lot of people involved in this. So we had group sessions with Punjabi older men and women, and we separated them because we know that often women don't have their voices heard in the community if the men are in the same room. Some people complained about that, but that's okay. They did end up saying different things, so we're glad we did it. We took the service providers and had different sessions with them. We followed up with them on the surveys, what we found in the surveys, what I just showed you, and then we talked more about the determinants of mental health with them, so I'll share that with you. Importantly, we provided food. That food was Punjabi food, and it was provided by local providers, recommended by the advisory committee. This may seem trivial, but it is not. And then we had a summary of what happened in each of the groups. It was delivered in both Punjabi and in English, because some of the service providers weren't Punjabi speakers. And I can tell you that the seniors were at least as lively in their contributions to that discussion as the service providers, perhaps more so. So from the seniors, this just gives you an idea of what we asked the seniors. They were really asked fairly generally, what can you tell us about the programs you attend, if any? And we probed more specifically with the questions you see here in the slide. And just quickly, I'd like to give you a summary of what the older men told us. And we've divided what they told us into those 3 determinants. So you can see, that really these 3 categories resonate well with the kinds of things that they were telling us. They, in terms of social inclusion, they were very willing to attend forums like the one we offered and other things when they're aware of the programs and services. And they really expressed a strong desire to have cross-cultural interaction, which my Punjabi collaborators were saying, and I had noticed as well, was really quite different from about 10 years ago. There is much more of an appetite now for that cross-cultural interaction. But they came across a number of different barriers. Language, obviously, transportation sometimes, finding a location was often very difficult. Some of them, a surprising number of them, because they were all, most of them in their 70s and 80s, some of them were still working. So finding time, because they were still working, was an issue. And this is important to note. This is an outcome. The reason that they're working is because they are sponsored. And their children are responsible for all of their expenses. And so they lose status in their families. They have come from situations where they were the heads of their families and often very important people in their communities. And this is why they have been able to migrate to Canada. You have to realize that. Not everybody gets over here, right? They come here, and they are immediately disempowered in the broader community by virtue of their loss of the ability to communicate. They don't know anything about how the system works here, but their sponsoring children presumably know a bit more, at least, some of them a lot more. They may have daughters-in-laws who grew up here and speak English very fluently and drive and so on. They may have driven back home, but they find it difficult to get their driver's license here sometimes, although some of them had managed to do that. And so many people, when they come here as seniors, I missed the 5-minute, engage in a lot of work, women and men alike. So this is one of the things. So freedom from violence and discrimination, you see how these things feed into each other. They've lost respect, they need help finding work and so on. For women, the main issue was the confidence and their self-esteem, and they're very much hampered by the need to provide childcare services. So I'm actually going to skip over promising practices because you can look at the slides later. You can see this slide here. These are some of the promising practices and also needs of community, as well as barriers provided by service providers. These will all be very, very familiar to you. What I'd like to emphasize is that when we tend to the needs of immigrant seniors, we need to recognize how dependent they are on their children, the challenges that represents for their self-esteem, the fact that many families do not have the capacity to recognize mental health issues such as dementia and depression, and the fact that while childcare is rewarding, it is also very restricting in terms of people being able to access social supports and the services that can help them. So we do need to include family members, but with caution. And we need to understand that we need to reach out to people in their communities. Only 5 to 15% of Punjabi seniors in Abbotsford and Surrey were being reached according to the combined estimates of the service providers in our forums. So we need to raise awareness of programs and provide direct outreach, recognizing those barriers, particularly childcare issues. And finally, we see with social inclusion, the Vic Health Framework has a definition for social inclusion. And we see that it is not the hesitation of the Punjabi seniors to integrate that is or to collaborate with others that is the barrier to them doing so. Rather, we have to really guide them towards how they can get to those services and reach out to them in different ways. So, time flies when you're having fun. Please go ahead and check out the ResearchGate page. You can look at these slides as well, and I've actually provided live links on this page for you to get to those papers as well. Thank you.